So this video is going to be the first in a series that I'll be working on, which is trying to reconcile the texts of Vatican II with traditional Catholic teaching, which is an issue that's often brought to my attention. I know in Catholic circles, the whole question of Vatican II is a very contentious one. There's not a whole lot of unanimity on the question, but to my way of thinking, I don't reject Vatican II as formally heretical. I do recognize it as a legitimate ecumenical council, even though I do recognize also that a lot of ambiguities are contained in it, and I understand that in the crafting of the documents you did have a lot of deceptive, selective wording that was inspired by a modernist spirit among many of the Council Fathers. Many of the Council Fathers were also very orthodox and traditional, and my view is that the end product, the documents themselves, as to their letter, while ambiguous and problematic and difficult to deal with in light of tradition, nevertheless, it's not formally heretical per se. And one of the major controversial documents that came out of it was Dignitatis Humanae, and that's the question, or that tackles rather the question of religious liberty, the role of religious liberty. What does the church teach on religious liberty? And a lot of traditionalists think that this is one of the major documents that broke away from traditional Catholic teaching, and that's why you have groups like the Society of St. Pius X who broke away from what they would call the conciliar church. And it's also been partially contributed to the sedevacantist movement because a lot of them see what they see to be heresies contained in this document as evidence that the chair of Peter is actually vacant. And so it's really caused a lot of controversy and a lot of discord among the faithful. And I completely understand why there are reservations about it, and serious ones at that, because like the other Vatican II documents, it is highly ambiguous, and I by no means am making the argument that it's a wonderful document and without critique. But on the other hand, I'm not prepared to simply reject this and the Second Vatican Council in general outright, because I think that leads to all sorts of absurd consequences, like I said, sedevacantism and the like. No, I think it's important to, as best we can, try to reconcile the letter of the documents with traditional Catholic teaching, and in this case, see if we can't discern the true and proper relationship between the Church and the state. Now, it should be said that while I do accept the Second Vatican Council as to the letter of the documents, it also needs to be understood that I don't consider them to be infallible and dogmatic, and neither did Pope Paul VI. The Vatican II is understood to be a pastoral council. It is not backed up by the charism of infallibility because there aren't any dogmatic pronouncements in the actual documents themselves. So, in principle, there could be error in it. But my argument is going to be that as to the letter of the documents, they can be reconciled with traditional Catholic teaching. So, while this by no means is going to be able to settle all the ambiguities and the doubts, it will, and it is always helpful to at least draw attention to the needfulness of addressing this issue and to attempt to draw out a means by which a path towards a resolution can be carried out. The central argument that I'm going to be using with respect to Dignitatis Humanae is, I should mention, in a large part inspired by the work of a scholar by the name of Thomas Pink, and I will link a lecture that he did on the question in the description below. So the question seems to center on whether, on the basis of the true religion, the state can legitimately use its coercive power to propagate the true religion and to suppress the influence of false religions. Conservatives, for lack of a better word, obviously I don't mean in the sense of American conservatives or the strictly political sense of the term, but theological conservatives concerning this issue, for lack of a better word, would argue in the affirmative. This is because they abide by the maxim, and a very true maxim at that error has no rights. On this view, to declare religious liberty an inviolable right, derivative of human dignity, would be to afford to false religions a dignity of their own, which would constitute an absurdity since falsity of itself has no positive existence of any kind that could, in principle, possess any dignity whatsoever. That this follows, according to this line of thinking, is due to the fact that liberty implies a multiplicity of objects with which to align one's will. But since there is only one true religion, any other object with which one could align one's will under the category of religion would be to align one's will with something false, which can never be said to be good. But if the liberty to align one's will with something false is derivative of a fundamental human dignity, then it would follow that those wrongful objects would in some way also be dignified, since choosing those wrongful objects would be an extension of the human dignity that would afford them the natural right to do precisely that. But this is clearly absurd. Therefore, they argue that the Second Vatican Council erred egregiously in declaring religious liberty a right. They believe that it flatly contradicted what Pope Leo XIII taught under the ordinary magisterium in his encyclical Immortale Dei. Now, this is a central issue that caused Marcel Lefebvre to consecrate those four bishops illicitly in direct contradiction to the will of Pope John Paul II at the time. Lefebvre believed that the Church had in effect given its rights away, and that the Church has given a blessing to religious indifferentism, a condemned error which states that no religion can claim objective superiority to any other, and that this principle ought to be always and everywhere reflected in civil society. For this reason, Lefebvre believed his act was, in a sense, an act of self-defense, that he considered a survival operation, that had he not intervened, this perceived heresy would then spread throughout the entire church and cost her souls. Now, given the nature of this controversy, there is the opposing view to the, for lack of a better word, the conservative side. These would be, for lack of a better word, the liberals. Now they, like Lefebvre in a way, believe that there is indeed a rupture in the teaching of the Second Vatican Council's decree on religious liberty and that of Leo XIII's condemnation of indifferentism that lies at the heart of Immortale Dei. Like the Lefebvrists, they just choose to reject or to ignore. Instead of ignoring Dignitatis Humanae, however, they ignore Immortale Dei. Now this is wrong-headed because no piece of magisterium ought to be ignored in favor of another. Instead, the magisterium of the Church ought to be read to the best of one's ability in complete continuity, as the opinion of Pope Benedict XVI. Now, obviously, there can be discrepancies and ambiguities and difficulties in certain pieces of the ordinary, non-infallible magisterium, and sometimes you have to prefer one over another. My point is that you can't just flatly ignore or reject one piece of magisterium in favor of another without really trying to reconcile them and try to read them in continuity with each other. Interestingly enough, the liberals and some of these traditionalists, at their deepest root, come together with their opinion of the council. Both are of the opinion that the council constitutes a discontinuity and rupture from what the Church has taught in the past. If this is the case, however, then the indefectibility of the Church promised to us by Christ has become lost, whether it's through mass apostasy, as the Lefebvrists would believe, or through a radical evolution of doctrine, disguised as a development of doctrine, which is a key tenet of modernism, as rigorously and vehemently condemned by Pope St. Pius X. So it's important that the Leonine teaching, the teaching of Leo XIII, and the teaching of Vatican II can be read in continuity with each other, since both documents are products of the Church's teaching authority that, while is not necessarily granted the charism of infallibility, nevertheless must possess within themselves, taken together, a continuity that can beget proper orthodoxy without repugnance to reason or the principle of non-contradiction. Now, in order to do this, I think a brief overview of these documents should be looked over, followed by key aspects of both of those documents that seem to conflict with each other, and followed by those resolutions and objections to those resolutions, and then replies to some of those objections. First, I think we should look at Immortale Dei, since that's the one that came before Dignitatis Humanae, promulgated by Leo XIII. This was promulgated on November 1st, 1885. Leo XIII, in this encyclical, he begins by extolling the goodness and excellence of the Catholic Church in history. He acknowledges that a novel conception of law and of the state is emerging in the 19th century, but he ensures the faithful that such novelties surrounding their conception of liberty are more or less in error. The Christian view of the state, he goes on to say, is such that man's natural inclination to be integrated in a civil society ought to be recognized, as well as his inclination to be directed towards his natural and supernatural end, God, within the context of that civil society. So he condemns the notion that the state is some necessary evil that has to be tolerated for the sake of the public order, as well as the notion that the state of itself has no obligations to God, as the origin and end of all things, even of the temporal order. This theme is in many ways repeated and cuts to the essence of the entire document's meaning. This notion of the state deriving its authority from God, as well as being imbued within it an obligation to foster natural religion, is conjoined by logical extension to the fact that there is, in fact, a proper way to worship God as revealed by him through his Catholic Church. The veracity of the Catholic religion cannot be separated from the state's obligation to foster and facilitate the supreme end of man to render unto God his due through proper worship. And so the Church and the state are called to mutual cooperation as the soul and the body, as an analog of this. The Church, since she is entrusted by Christ with the Great Commission, possesses of herself an independent, supreme right to freely enact her directives fitting to the ends of which she is competent. Nevertheless, in the temporal order, this independence, if it is to be actualized, ought to be safeguarded by the temporal powers in order that these directives can be ordained without resistance and undue difficulty. God, therefore, has ordained two dimensions of the social order, supernatural and natural, ecclesial and civil. Each dimension has an autonomy and an independence of its own, and has its own scope of jurisdiction, yet they overlap in the measure that these subjects of both independent scopes of jurisdiction, they come together as one and the same. More fundamentally, however, they come together as to their common principle of origin, which is God. God is the grounding of stately and ecclesiastical authority, and so he has ordained in his divine wisdom that, inasmuch as the subjects of ecclesiastical and civil jurisdiction overlap, these two dimensions of the social order, albeit autonomous of themselves, ought to cooperate with each other to facilitate each other's supernatural and natural ends, respectively, according to Pope Leo XIII. Now, maybe autonomous might not be the right word because it comes with certain connotations that we might want to avoid, but independence might be a better way to phrase it. It must be said, though, that this document is very careful to ensure that in the supernatural order, that is, in the matters of religion, where the state and the church cooperate to direct their common subjects, this jurisdiction is derivative entirely of the church, since she alone has the power to direct her subjects as baptized persons. The state has no competency whatsoever of itself to direct its subjects toward the supernatural end, but, according to Leo XIII, may facilitate the church in this sacred endeavor that is hers alone, should there be a consenting union between the church and the state established, say, constitutionally. So now that the teaching of Leo XIII regarding church and state has been laid out, the same assessment of Dignitatis Humanae, the Second Vatican Council document on religious liberty, should be given here. Dignitatis Humanae begins with a social, societal observation. That is, the Council Fathers acknowledge that contemporary man is progressively expanding in its range of freedoms, particularly pertaining to religious matters in society. Before commenting on these shifts, however, the Council Fathers make an explicit commitment to remain faithful to what the Church's magisterium has previously taught when it comes to the subject, which doubtless includes the principles magisterially enshrined in Leo XIII, as well as in the Council of Trent concerning the Church's stance on religious liberty as previously drawn out. The Church, therefore, in this very document, retains a repugnance towards the notion that Vatican II is going to constitute some kind of discontinuity and rupture with the past. On the contrary, the document affirms the continuity of past magisterium and intends to further develop what has been taught in the past as applicable to the current circumstance in which the church finds herself. Principles can't change, but the application of those principles are mediated through the mode of the current circumstance. Therefore, the current circumstance has to be taken into consideration so as to faithfully execute what the church believes in action. Now, as to the content of the document itself, the theme, of course, is on religious liberty and how the church understands this concept as actualized in the modern world and how to react to it whilst staying faithful to her mission. The Council Fathers begin the body of the document with a bold claim. They declare that, quote, the human person has a right to religious freedom, and that, quote, freedom of this kind means that all men should be immune from coercion on the part of individual social groups and every human power, so that, within due limits, nobody is forced to act against his convictions, nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accordance with his convictions in religious matters, in private or in public, alone or in association with others. That's Dignitatis Humanae, Article 2. They furthermore decree that this right is founded upon the dignity of the human person itself, as recognized by civil right. Coercion with regards to the religious matters, according to the document, can only be done by the state only for the sake of, quote, just requirements of the public order, unquote, and that's Article 8. Now, one can easily conceive of a practical example of this. Say, for example, there is an epidemic of Islamic jihadism in a given society, or in a sect of Islamists interpret the Quran to justify certain acts of barbarism and use places of worship as a means of radicalizing young adherents to their violent cause. Now, such a case is obviously one where the state can and should intervene and restrict the religious liberty of such a sect in order to maintain peace and social stability. The Vatican document further insists that the assent of the intellect and the will is a metaphysically free act, and this must be directed towards religious truth in accordance with this freedom as in conformity with his or her informed conscience. This is because, quote, the practice of religion of its very nature consists primarily of those voluntary and free internal acts by which man directs himself to God, and that's Article 3. If the state, therefore, infringes upon this free internal assent of the intellect and will towards religious matters, then it's overstepped its boundary, again, assuming the just requirements of the public order are otherwise kept intact. Now, this freedom has several implications. First, it means that religious communities, according to the document, have to be given the freedom to proselytize. Second, they have to be able to erect religious buildings or houses of worship. Third, they have to be able to educate their children in their religious tradition. And finally, they have to be permitted to organize in social groups that are centered around a specific religious tradition. These all have to be granted by the state according to the document, and the state of itself has no right to infringe on these rights derivative of the personal obligation of each man to seek religious truths, which is founded on human nature itself. The document then goes on to insist that this teaching is founded on the revealed Word of God, and especially through the personal dispositions of Christ, who, quote, brought his revelation to perfection when he accomplished on the cross the work of redemption by which he achieved salvation and true freedom for all men, and in the process of this refused to force or to impose on those who spoke out against it. That's Article 11. This teaching, however, is aimed principally towards the end that, quote, and this is very important, that the church can enjoy in law and in fact those stable conditions which gave her the independence necessary for fulfilling her divine mission. Dignitatis Humanae, Article 12. So now that these two documents have kind of been laid out, as to the letter of those documents, it shouldn't be difficult for us to see how this might present rather awkward conflicts. First, the two most obvious apparent contradictions are the following. In Immortale Dei, Pope Leo XIII teaches, quote, it is not lawful for the state, any more than for the individual, either to disregard all religious duties or to hold in equal favor different kinds of religion, that the unrestrained freedom of thinking and of openly making known one's thoughts is not inherent in the rights of citizens, and is by no means to be reckoned worthy of favor and support. Immortale Dei, Article 35. However, this obviously seems to be flatly contradicted by the Council Fathers of Vatican II, who expressly declare precisely that all men must be protected on account of human dignity from any intrusion into religious matters whatsoever, so long as they don't pose a threat to the public order. How can these two propositions possibly be reconciled? One way to treat the condemnations of religious liberty by Pope Leo XIII, Pius IX, and Gregory XVI, one way to deal with this is to kind of see them as condemnations of discipline. So in other words, their condemnations are just disciplinary prescriptions for how religious liberty ought to be treated, and so they're free to be contradicted by posterior magisterium. This is the opinion, actually, this is the private opinion, I should say, of Benedict XVI, who proposed a distinction between the principles and the mere application in an effort to defend his view of the conciliar continuity discussed earlier. In a 2005 speech, I think he said this. But this doesn't seem to hold up, because at the time that Leo XIII put out his encyclical, it was understood at the time that the idea that the church doesn't have a right to impose upon the faithful, with help of the secular arm, punishments or to use coercive temporal measures, this was seen as close to heresy, or actually a heresy in itself. So it seems to me that this can't just be seen as disciplinary, but really touches on the doctrine of the church. Now, I think to sort of pave out a way of reconciling these two texts, we have to employ a key interpretive lens. And to do this, we have to make a sharp distinction between a state that is not united to the church, as the body is united to the soul, to use Leo XIII's analogy, and a state that is, on account of its foundational constitution, say, explicitly united the church as a de jure Catholic state. There's a fundamental, one could say, even a metaphysical difference between the two. In such a scenario, two independent dimensions of jurisdiction come into contact with one another, ecclesiastical and civil. Now, it must be maintained that the church is its own independent source of jurisdiction, as is essential to Catholic dogma. Since this is the case, the church must be said to have a specific class of subjects under this jurisdiction. This can only be the baptized, who, through this sacrament of initiation, enter under the church's jurisdiction, are immediately subject to her own laws, and by logical extension, penalties. The church's capacity to enact penalties traditionally are twofold, according to Suarez. The first is to defend her right to accomplish her mission. Second, to protect those who are already baptized. Now, in order to effectively accomplish this, there has to be more to the means by which she could carry this out than just the ability or the capacity to enact spiritual penalties. For if men flatly reject the divine origin of the church, this could hardly be seen as a deterrent to conform to what they are by baptism bound to uphold. So Suarez teaches that the church, in principle, could make use of temporal penalties of coercion in order to fulfill those two ends. With respect to the former, that is, defense of her own mission, against those who would use malice to prevent her, these penalties could be harsh in nature. With respect to the latter, though, such penalties could be more indirect, which would fit the immaterial nature of crimes against the faith in itself. Under what circumstance, though, could the church licitly use temporal means of coercion, which would require cooperation with the state to achieve those ends? Does not Vatican II outright rule this out as a legitimate possibility by commanding the state to treat religion as inviolate in every respect? Now, as I mentioned before, Thomas Pink, he offers a solution to this, I think. If the state has refused to surrender itself under the supernatural jurisdiction of the church, that is, refuses to constitutionally recognize itself as a community of the baptized, then such a state has no authority whatsoever to coerce in religious matters at all. This is because, in principle, the state can never possess that authority to begin with. This authority can only and solely be derived from a supernatural authority, only over those who are, by supernatural adoption, under its jurisdiction. The state, since under this scenario it would have surrendered itself under the jurisdiction of the Church as constitutionally a community of baptized persons, would then merely be a means by which the Church could more easily fulfill these two juridical ends of penalizing baptized persons who are under juridical obligation to obey the laws to which they are bound by virtue of their baptismal obligations. Now, it may be objected, however, that the Second Vatican Council makes absolutely no mention of this distinction, and that, quite to the contrary, the spirit of the text clearly favors a universal toleration of religion in principle, whether constitutive expressly of a community of baptized persons or not. As it clearly states, quote, "It is therefore entirely in accordance with the nature of faith that every kind of human coercion be excluded from religion," Article 10. More to the point, Canon 14 of Session 7 of the Council of Trent expressly decrees that it is anathema to hold that those baptized persons who obstinately refuse to partake in their baptismal vows are, quote, "not to be compelled meanwhile to a Christian life by any other penalty, save that they be excluded from participation in the Eucharist and other sacraments." How are these two decrees not in direct contradiction with each other, where the former is the teaching of the Second Vatican Council and the latter constitutes the teaching of an ecumenical council, and contains within it the spirit of Leonine teaching? First, it must be insisted that no matter how natural or immediately plausible a particular reading is, it must be interpreted in light of what the Church had previously taught on the specific matter. Therefore, if it is possible that Dignitatis Humanae might be reconciled as to its contents with what the Church had previously taught, not only in Immortale Dei, but also in Mirari Vos of Gregory XVI, the Syllabus of Errors of Pius IX, Pius X, etc. Now, I think this is entirely possible, for, as Thomas Pink points out, Dignitatis Humanae is concerned as to its very title, with the right of the person and communities to social and civil liberty in religious matters, within the context of modern states, which by their nature are severed from essential constitutional unity with the Church, as in a soul-body union, as an analog. If such a unity is broken or is non-existent, then those two hemispheres of jurisdiction no longer enjoy their unity with one another. And since the right to coerce in religious matters is belonging solely to the Church as a supernatural privilege only over the baptized, then the state loses all of its competency to conjoin with the Church in those pursuits, since this competency is entirely derivative. This is why Dignitatis Humanae only leaves so few exceptions that are concerned solely with the maintenance of the public order, which would be safeguarded under something like the principle of double effect, whereby the intent is not to coerce in religious matters, but to ensure the maintenance of the public order with the unintended consequence of coercing religiously. That this is the case is made even more clear in the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which states, quote, "The law can establish other expiatory penalties which deprive a member of the Christian faithful of some spiritual or temporal good, and which are consistent with the supernatural purposes of the Church," Canon 1321. This would be impossible if the Church was conjoined with no stately cooperation in carrying out such penalties, which have spiritual crimes chiefly as their objects, that is, acts committed which run directly contrary to the baptismal promises that each baptized person, by virtue of their baptism, are bound to uphold. Thus, even conciliar teaching bears witness to the traditional teaching in express terms, understood within the context of the community of the baptized, as it has always been understood, from medieval and counter-Reformation language up through Leonine language. Under this interpretation alone, then, can these two texts, two sides of religious liberty, be reconciled without awkwardness or a threat to orthodoxy. How might this work in practice, though? I should say that if the Church and the state are so conjoined as a soul-body union, that religious coercion on part of the baptized ought to be contextualized within those two dimensions of ecclesiastical penal jurisdiction, as described above and iterated by Suarez, that is, defensive and protective. Now, if the state is constitutionally united to the Church as reflective of its very identity, then attacks on the Church must concern the state as actual harm done to its citizenry, since citizenry is specially united to baptismal integration into the church. Therefore, if a baptized person causes spiritual malice to the church, the punitive measures would be overt and direct. It should be said that, given prudence, such should only be done if the union of the state with the church is so strongly felt that the truth of the Catholic faith is seen as eminently evident and without much need of apologetic defense. Interestingly enough, there's a parallel to this in modern society, where crimes of like what they see to be racism or whatever are often conjoined with penal consequences. You see this in Europe all the time right now. I mean, with the Tommy Robinson case and everything. Now, I disagree, obviously, with the principles by which they base their coercive penalties, but clearly modern states have no problem with the underlying principle employed here. The real question is, which principles are actually right? Should we be defending egalitarianism? Well, I don't think so. We should be defending the truth of the Catholic faith. But that's just to give a kind of a parallel example to this underlying principle applied in my view, a warped and backwards way in modern states. The other dimension of ecclesiastical penal jurisdiction, however, would seem to me to require a much more indirect means of penal backlash, such as an imposed exclusion from certain segments of society. And this is because this transgression is chiefly spiritual and intellectual in nature with respect to his relation to the church. He's not trying to be overtly malicious toward the church, but nevertheless he is contradicting and going against his baptismal promises. So, and on this view, the state with the church could maybe exclude such a baptized person from certain participations in society in order to reconcile him to the church, but in a much more indirect way. So not depriving him of actual temporal goods, but maybe refusing him a certain social status that he would have if he were actually reconciled with the church and faithful to his baptismal promises. Now, this is in full conformity with what is taught in the Council of Trent, Immortale Dei, and the Second Vatican Council, and clearly the 1983 Code of Canon Law, for this does not apply to a society such as the United States, or the vast majority of countries nowadays. This is because in modern societies there is no constitutional unity of the church and the state as a community of baptized persons. And if any principle is held in common among all those who participate in this debate, it's that the church has no right to coerce religiously with respect to the unbaptized, since they are outside her jurisdiction. So the Second Vatican Council is right indeed to condemn religious discrimination and coercion in modern societies, not only to safeguard the dignity of the person so that they may freely assent to the faith without an unbaptized government interfering, but also to protect the church, since the constitutional unity that has been severed can no longer guarantee her protection to carry out her fundamental mission and to bring souls to heaven. That is her chief aim and will always be more fundamental to whether or not this mission is facilitated with the help of the state. Now, it's the relation of the state to the church, and not vice versa, which determine which of these two applications of the same principle the church will adopt. If the state chooses to unite itself with the church under an explicit constitution, then the church will happily consent and act in direction of the baptized toward their supernatural end with the help of the state. If not, then the church will permit the state its independence, yet insist that her freedom be safeguarded, and that the state not transgress its natural bounds in any religious coercion whatsoever. This seems to me to be the best way to understand the church's magisterium on this point, and the best way to reconcile these two very difficult and awkward texts when put together. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informative. I'll be doing more videos on Vatican II in the future. God bless.